Lise, I'm very glad you left out the juicy details, especially the details of the juicy steaks that we would sometimes eat to forget the sore plight of being a PhD student. I first of all want to thank Elisabeth for persuading me or for allowing me to come, even if it's not 50 years, but 52 and a half. I want to congratulate the whole department, students, everybody for having made it. I think the Juda Palasch Institute, which has large parallels with Frankfurt, we also have a plaque, and we're also not allowed to call ourselves an institute, so that's good. We won't have our jubilee yet. And I always begin with a couple of disclaimers, and I only one big one, or maybe two big ones. The first is, I apologize especially to Elisabeth for this very dismal picture as the beginning of a celebratory, festive lecture. And the good news is that I will not be talking about the importance of Jewish studies for the discussion on the Anthropocene. So everybody who came to hear the Jewish studies potential, you should have listened to the Oxford Interfaith Forum last week. Or is it this week? No, maybe it's as we speak. Laurie Zoloth speaking on climate change and Jewish thought. Maybe it's actually right now that she's speaking. So you can, those of you who are looking at home, you can sort of delete me and move to Oxford. The slightly disclaimer I should add is that, of course, this will reflect, this talk will to a large part reflect my own experience in Jewish studies, which was mostly, not exclusively, but mostly gained in the Netherlands. So there will be a slightly Dutch flavor, but that ties in nicely with the afternoon in which we've heard 7 talks of colleagues who, and I want to say this out loud, do the incredible. On a shoestring, they keep Jewish studies alive in Europe, comparatively well off in Amsterdam. What am I going to do? I'm going to professionelles Audio einstellen.
I will try to get it away, but I'm not sure why it's there.
It's probably because of me. So I'm not going to talk about the importance of Jewish studies for the discussion of eco-criticism and the Anthropocene. Not because I don't think the humanities have a lot to say about it. I think the humanities do. I mean, if we're talking about human-made geology, then the humanities do have a say about human-made geology. And I think Jewish studies are no exception. But that's precisely the point. I mean, as humanities, Jewish studies can say a lot about the Anthropocene, but only as humanities. And for me, that is not where the strong point of Jewish studies lies. For me, the strong point of Jewish studies is when they're not just one of the humanities. And in all the 7 presentations that we heard this afternoon, it was very clear that institutionally, Jewish studies are not just one of the humanities. And if I would say anything today, it's let's keep it that way. Let's be humanities, but let's never just become one of the humanities. And that's the beginning of my SWOT analysis, because I've spent of the past 25 years as a professor of Hebrew in Amsterdam, I've spent 17 years in faculty administration, so I'm hardly a scholar, but I can do a SWOT analysis. And this is my SWOT analysis of Jewish studies in Europe, and this is specifically in Europe. And it's the full elements of my talk tonight. First of all, I would claim that what is a particular strong point of Jewish studies is that it is not one of the humanities, but a dialectical paradigm. It's not a counter paradigm, it's not contra, it's not de, it's not anti, it's not neo, it's dialectical in the good old Hegelian sense that it contributes and should transform. That can also be a weakness. That's also what we've heard this afternoon, being scattered all over faculties, being dislocated really, and it's sometimes a matter of local tradition, local culture, where your Jewish studies end up. No, I mean, if I look at the colleagues from Finland and Belgium, no department. I look at Saverio Campanini, 6 colleagues in the whole of Italy. I've listened to Francois, who's the lucky bastard, with 9 colleagues in UCL. So you're on the S side of the dialectical paradigm, but I would say that the S of the SWOT, of the strength, does have its downsides, often personal downsides. A shorter part of my talk will be, and I would like to sort of contextualize this historically, this idea of the dialectical paradigm. I would like also, because of my track record as an administrator, talk about a couple of trends in higher education. And again, in terms of, are they good or are they bad? Well, no. After some deliberation, I wrote the T of threat, but because I'm an optimist and because I'm trained to do SWOT analyses, I know that I have to write the O after the threat. They are also opportunities. Yes, they are. Societal echoes is the third part, because this talk is really also about the relevance of Jewish studies. We want to be relevant in the Anthropocene, and not just as one of the humanities, but as a bit more. And I would say the societal echoes are sometimes quite problematic, but they can be an opportunity. I'll say a few words about that. And then I will give the Amsterdam solution, which is a temporary solution, and it ties in with what Saverio Campanini said this afternoon. Maybe the kind of university academic and also European landscape in which Jewish studies arose, in which the Frankfurt department could start to begin to prosper, they have changed. And if we want to go into the future, maybe we have to take some funny decisions. You don't know where your partners are, you don't know what your themes will be. And that is what I'm going to conclude this talk. So we're going to talk about the dialectical paradigm, good or bad, trends in higher education. Well, as an administrator, I will say neutral. Societal echoes, they are what they are. Critical Jewish studies, the temporary Amsterdam solution. But let's start. Help. Ik kan het hoor, ik ga gewoon dit knopje drukken. Yes. We are talking Jewish studies in Europe, but I would say that Jewish studies in Europe are always Jewish studies and Europe. It's also a lot about Europe, and it's also a lot about being Jewish or doing Jewish studies in Europe. And for me, the image that goes with this is the image of the asymptote. And I was hardly a crack in mathematics, but I know what an asymptote is. The asymptote is the image of the axis and the curve. And what is the great secret of the curve is also the thing that Achilles and the rabbit knew and Zeno's paradoxes knew. The curve will never touch the axis. The image I derive from the guy right up in the right upper hand corner, Abd al-Malik Sayed, and he's maybe most famous as one of Pierre Bourdieu's associates. He came from Algeria. He has written a lot about migration, and what he says about migration, I think you can more or less transplant it to Jewish life in Europe. It's life on the asymptote, which means that you can approach majority culture, but you will never, ever merge with majority culture. And this very fact, life on the asymptote and a little bit of space in between the curve and the X, that's where it happens. That's where it's dangerous, but it's also where it's exciting, where it can be productive. Somebody who drew the conclusion that it shouldn't necessarily be productive is, of course, Max Jolek, who wrote a treatise calling for German minorities to desintegriert euch, to dissociate from European majority host societies. Well, there's a bit more to it than that, but it's an old topos. The guy on the right, 1907, Georg Simmel, Exkurs über den Fremden, essay on the stranger, also emphasizes who is a stranger. It's the one on the, he didn't use the image, of course, of the asymptote, but it's, he says it in different words. He says the stranger is the one who comes and never goes away, and by that very fact becomes a stranger, and also forges a group into recognizing strangers. And that's the position where Jews, and I would say Jewish studies, find themselves in. And one of the earliest, or maybe not, yeah, one of the earlier testimonies is from Moses Mendelssohn in his discussion with Johann David Michaelis, where at the end he exasperatedly says, how many millennia do we have to be here in order not to be strangers? If you know the asymptote, you know that it is an infinite number of millennia. And this is my point, and I could stop now. Jewish studies is working on and with the asymptote. And that's what I would like to talk a bit more about. And I would like to pick out two moments in history. One is 1968, because of UCL and the great flourishing, but of course also the establishment of my own chair in Hebrew and Jewish studies, which was very typical for the 1960s. And precisely 150 years earlier, the beginning of academic study of Judaism outside academia by the Wissenschaft des Judentums. And I will only talk about Zunz and Steinschneider for the simple reason that, well, that's a different story. I won't go down the alley where I start contending that I don't believe there was such a thing as the Wissenschaft des Judentums. But I think that in the case of Zunz and Steinschneider, I feel safe saying that that was a Wissenschaft des Judentums outside the walls of the university, but purely academic. What was the asymptotic situation were the context of Zunz's 1818 groundbreaking, pioneering, well, we've heard it all, book on how to study Judaism academically. Zunz was facing a European view of Judaism that found Judaism in a societal way slightly relevant, but above all, irrelevant. And I've highlighted the three aspects of the irrelevance of the Jews for Europe as a starting point for how Zunz is going to try to turn the tables. First of all, one might say that in the beginning of the 19th century, as in the centuries before, Jews in Europe were seen as what Jeremy Cohen has called hermeneutical Jews. They were part of the Christian tradition, and as part of the Christian tradition, they were framed from the Christian tradition, above all in a religious way. And if at all, and you see here Ahasverus, the wandering Jew, forced to eternal exile because he failed to help and recognize Christ dying on the cross. And it's not a coincidence that Ahasverus doesn't look like, well, I don't know, like Brad Pitt in Thelma and Louise. He looks like a slightly older man because it is obvious by the time Christianity arrives, Judaism is past its prime. So there's no viability to Judaism, not religiously, but also, not, and of course, if hermeneutical Jews receive a positive connotation, it's via their Hebrew knowledge, it's via their Old Testament heritage, let's put it like that. It's via their Hebraismus. Keep the term in mind, or not in mind, it's on the sheet. So hermeneutical Jews have zero viability. It's the image conjured by Schleiermacher saying that Judaism is eine unverwesliche Mumie. It's the mummy who never passes away. And when I was preparing this talk, I always practice with my wife, and she said, "Who's the guy?" And I said, "I don't even know. But if you're a mummy, you don't have. If you want to become a mummy, you don't, how do you say, object to being exposed." But that's what happened to Judaism. Judaism was exposed as this mummy. You see a person. You can see it's a man, but it can't move. And it's also not a particular, it's not Brad Pitt in Thelma and Louise. It can't move in any direction. There's no cultural viability for Judaism. Religiously framed, culturally framed, and then there is the habitus of the Jews, which by the time that Zunz was writing, even Zunz was framing it in that direction, the habitus of the Jews, which was not framed as Hebraismus, but as Rabbinismus. The statue that I'm showing you here, and it must be from the Katz Ehrenthal collection, is slightly later, it's late 19th centuries, and there's various features that betray that fact. But for me, it's the idea of a cultural way of life, welkom, gaat u lekker zitten, a cultural way of life, a habitus. If you look at the guy, that's out of sync with time, it's pre-modern, it's not of modernity. Religiously framed, culturally inviolable, the Jews are destined to remain relegated to the realm of pre-modernity. And that is what Zunz's Wissenschaft des Judentums was going to change. This very idea of, let's say, European Christian, but more than just religious dissociation was going to be turned into association. Jews were going to be associated with the European project, the German project, but as we shall see, also the European project. And his way of doing this was propagating the utter relationality, and I think this is also a word that we can take away to the future of Jewish studies, the utter relationality of Europe's Jews with European culture. You see here three, I think, quite archetypal books, probably, hopefully, relatively well-known books from the classical Wissenschaft des Judentums. On the left, you see Zunz's Zur Geschichte und Literatur, 1845, a rehabilitation of the study of Judaism in medieval Germany and France, as opposed to the Sephardi mystique. But look at the title. Zur Geschichte und Literatur, not zur jüdischen Geschichte und Literatur. Here is Zunz's relationality visible in the... This is the book where Zunz develops the idea of Jewish literature. And I will come back to how he sees Jewish literature in relational terms. But the very fact that he writes a book, Zur Geschichte und Literatur, with a very particular axe to grind, namely to put on the map the medieval Jewish culture of Tzfat and Ashkenaz, the very fact is that he sees this as a contribution to the universal, not even European, the universal study of Geschichte und Literatur. I'll come back to that with a quotation in a second. The second book, Jewish Literature, it's an English translation of an earlier encyclopedia or handbook entry by Moritz Steinschneider, Jewish Literature from the 8th to the 18th century. And then you wonder, why 8th? Well, it's because this is the moment that Steinschneider can show that Jewish literature becomes relational. It becomes just like the literature of the Arabs. It becomes, well, in a way, it almost becomes modern. And what happens is that who's the big loser in this operation? It's classical rabbinical Jewish tradition, because that's not Jüdische Literatur, that's Literatur der Juden, that's Jewish national literature. And that's not the relational literature that he wants to highlight. So the very dating of the book, plus the idea to pick out Talmud and Midrash and give it a special introduction of its own, not emphatically not as part of Jewish literature, is, I would say, telling in this respect and telling of the relationality. Final book, the Arabische Literatur der Juden, was published 1902. Steinschneider was alive, barely alive, and it has the most lovely subtitle, namely Ein Beitrag zur Literaturgeschichte der Araber. And here you see Steinschneider radicalizing. I think it's Ismar Schosch who rightly says Steinschneider never really changed throughout his life. And I cannot disagree with that. Steinschneider is classical Wissenschaft, even in his very, very old age. But the times have changed. Mass nationalism is rampant. Zionism comes up. Steinschneider looks at both and hates them. So much so that he refuses to speak of the Jews as a nation. He prefers to call them a race, which by 1902 is truly not an unproblematic concept. But, and this is Steinschneider, the rebellious scholar, when he writes about the Arabische Literatur der Juden, it's not ein Beitrag zur Literaturgeschichte der Juden, not even to Europe, but of the Arabs. This is how relational Jewish literature can be. For Zunz, and this is a quotation from the 1845 publication, this relationality of the Jews with the European project is very much a matter of empathy. And empathy is maybe also a value alongside relationality that we should take with us when we talk about the future of Jewish studies. I quote, I translated it into English. It's not the best of German sentences, and I've brought in some periodization, but I'll read it to you out loud. Jüdische Literatur, and I didn't translate it because for Zunz it is a technical term. It's not Literatur der Juden, it's this symbiotic literature that Jews have produced. Is also, and then I highlighted a few things that are particularly noteworthy, I would say, is also most intimately bound up with the civilization of the ancients, the origins and development of Christianity, sure, no hard feelings here, and medieval scholarly activity, intervening in all intellectual currents of Vor- und Mitwelt. I trust Elisabeth to help me translate it, I had no idea. Sharing in their grief and struggles. This is not just sympathy, this is co-suffering. It completes, also an important word, general literature, yet with an organism of its own. What Zuntz is trying to picture here is the idea that if you allow Jewish literature to play a role into the totality of general literature, this totality will change. And this is, I think, also something that is, well, one of the capacities of Jewish studies. This dialectical moment in Jewish studies, allow them in and allow your own paradigm to be changed by this. This is certainly what people who established attempts or established Jewish studies or made attempts at establishing Jewish studies had in view. Look at the following quotation and relish it. This is again from more or less the same passage in Zur Geschichte und Literatur. If the totality of intellectual activity is a sea, then one of the currents that supply it with water is Jewish literature. And this is truly Hegel for dummies, because the idea is you have a Fluss, you have another Fluss, they meet each other, they are contrary to each other, but they have the capacity to aufheben each other. And aufheben is a word which you can say in German in just one go, but if you start translating it, you will have to use two words, because on the one hand, it's to cancel. When two rivers come into a sea or into an ocean, they cancel. I'm just wondering if people who are watching at home see me make all these lovely movements. They probably don't. They see my boobs. It's also fine. You can watch all you want. But I was talking Hegel for dummies. I'm sorry. So there's river A and there's river B. And when they meet and become an ocean, they cancel each other as rivers. But they also transform each other as rivers into something new. That's not a river, but it has certain, but it depends on these two currents merging together. And that is Hegel's idea of totality, which is of course the synthesis which transcends its components by cancelling them, but also simultaneously preserving them. I mean, it's genius and it's totally ununderstandable, but what is understandable is Zuntz's version and the very fact that he uses all these water metaphors in a century, a 19th century, which loves life metaphors. We still love life metaphors. We love talking about things even now in terms of rise, decline and fall. We love talking about the cross-pollination and cross-fertilization of cultures. If things are the result of cross-pollination, they are hybrid. There have been decades that we've been cherishing hybridity. What I particularly love about the early Wissenschafts water metaphors is they don't do biological metaphors. They don't talk about purity. This is not about the purity of the ocean. They do not talk about the hybridity of the ocean. The ocean is not hybrid. This is ein eigentümliches Drittes. Sorry for people not speaking German at home. Ein eigentümliches Drittes. The Drittes, I don't know how to translate that into English. And also the idea of difference, which Zuntz mentions in, kom op, deze. Yet with an organism of its own, yes, but this organism of its own is sublated in the ultimate ocean. There is no longer any difference. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the following quotation, you might think it's from Zuntz, but it isn't. I will read it in English, which is in fact raping this quotation, but never mind. Schleiermacher wouldn't have minded. And so our nation, by virtue of its respect for the foreign and its mediating nature, is destined to merge all treasures of foreign Wissenschaft and Kunst with its own, through its language, into a great historical whole, Totalität, ein Ganzes, to be kept in the center and the heart of Europe. This is Schleiermacher, 1813, über die verschiedenen Methoden des Übersetzens. And if you read this, you immediately recognize why Zuntz thought that his project would make sense. This is about sublation. This is about respecting the foreign, accepting the foreign, using language to mediate. Steinschneider till his dying day will say that the Jews are das Volk der Sprachen, where he says Volk actually. It is destined to merge through language into a great historical whole, and of course, and not incidentally, in the heart of Europe. This is 1818, the attempt to establish a kind of relational Jewish studies avant la lettre, which never reached the university. I'm going to move 150 years later, and I'm totally glossing over, this is one of my hobbies, to gloss over the period 1933-1945, which is, of course, at the background of and increasingly so, at the background of the development of Jewish studies. But not so much in the Netherlands, doe ik het nou goed? Moet deze hebben. Ja. Not so much in the Netherlands in 1968, when my chair, I'm certainly not the first to occupy that chair, but the chair I'm currently having was established. And maybe just to give you an idea of the roots of that chair, it was established in the Faculty of Humanities. And I'm going to give you the description, the job description to which I applied. It was the chair of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac languages and cultures from the 1st century AD. It started as a chair for Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac languages and cultures from the 3rd century AD. But then Professor Beek decided he was no longer going to do Mishnah, and his fellow colleague in the other faculty should, and so the 3rd century became the 1st century. And you can imagine that when I applied for the job, I had to brush up my Syriac. And I did, actually, because I was trained in Semitic languages. So I could do Syriac, Arabic, Ugaritic. The only thing I'm not particularly good at is Akkadian. All the other rest, been there, done that, passed the exam. In 1968, the chair was established, but of course the deliberations began in 1967, and that is not a coincidental year. And if we look at the same 3 parameters that we looked at when we talked about the earliest vestiges of Wissenschaft des Judentums in 1818, then we see that, at least for the Netherlands, and I'm afraid I can't frame it any differently, there's still a lot of interest in hermeneutical Jews in the Netherlands, also in relation to my own chair, or the chair in the Faculty of Literae, as it was then called. Christianity's Jewish roots. There is a relationality, and the interesting thing is that here the Christians are actually expressing the relationality, not the Jews. Simultaneously, you see that, I think it was Evan Zohar who said there is no symmetry in interference. There is not much symmetry in the relation. Jewish roots, Christian fruits. But simultaneously, there is an attempt at relationality, which also, to a very large extent, relies on, or has to do with processes of secularization and secularity. And there's at least one person, nee, but also, Thomas, heb jij ook nog bij Van Uggelen gestudeerd? Yeah, so there are at least 4 persons in this room who studied with Niek van Uggelen. And my impression had always been that he was the most secular of all people. And what we never knew was that while we were studying with him, he was slowly secularizing. And I think this was the fact for many, many Christians who were going in search of their Jewish roots. It was a way of, yeah, I find it very hard to frame because it didn't happen to me, but it was a way of keeping true to Christianity, while simultaneously allowing a certain degree of secularity also to inform your religion. So hermeneutical Jews still not entirely away. Cultural viability, not in Europe. I remember when for the first time, I read the introductory part of the Encyclopedia Judaica of 1971, I was amazed to read at some point the phrase that the Encyclopedia Judaica was meant as a big matzeva, a big gravestone for European Jewry and its history and culture. And I think certainly for Amsterdam, the cultural viability of the Jews was not at the time in Europe, but it was in the new state of Israel, which definitely fascinated lots and lots of secularizing Dutch Christians, and as such played a role. And I think again, 1968, François, this afternoon you spoke also about the, let's call it a revival, no, not a revival, an awakening of Black studies in the United States. This was not on the radar in Amsterdam. The radar was going east. The radar was 1967. And the other thing about 1967 was that it was the era of flower power, and flower power was all about diversity. This is not, so here the image, Sunz's image of the ocean can easily be replaced by the image of the rainbow. This is no longer about difference being sublated. This is about diversity being celebrated. And this is way before post-colonialism, when diversity again becomes a problem. This is the era no longer dominated by a purely religious conception of minorities, but also by a cultural conception of minorities. And the Jews, always a religious minority, suddenly, or gradually perhaps, find themselves the object of interest. They are one of the multicultural tapestry. With this flower power ethos, I think, and I'm quoting my colleague Reziane Fontaine, also from the Amsterdam department, with this flower power ethos also came a kind of taste for the exotic. And I would like to quote Reziane because she made a really immortal phrase about this. All the people who were really adventurous went to India and joined an ashram. Everybody who was slightly more petit bourgeois remained in the Netherlands and started flirting with Judaism. I don't know if it's true, but if she said, I'm inclined to believe everything Reziane taught me. So I think there is a degree, there's always some kernel of plausibility to this. Okay, so there is all of a sudden a huge societal relevance, but what about empathy? And I thought this was maybe a good moment to cherish Frankfurt and show you the first issue of Frankfurter Judaistische Beiträge. Notice the Heftklammer, the staples. I mean, those were the days. And I can tell you that there are at least 4 people, or maybe 5 people in this room who have read many Frankfurter Judaistische Beiträge, because one steady contributor to the Frankfurter Judaistische Beiträge was Arnold Goldberg. What I didn't know, but when I started looking into his biography, I found out his name was Arnold Maria Goldberg, which I never knew, so I learned something. And what did we read in the Frankfurter Judaistische Beiträge? We read his studies of Midrash and of rabbinic literature from an inner perspective. And I've been so bold to call it the emic perspective. He tried to write about rabbinic literature not from the outside, but more from the inside than even a rabbi could have written from the inside. He tried to explain rabbinic literature in totally structuralist terms as a relational system. And this is for the 4 people in the room who also read it. I sometimes wake up at night and I say, Dictum ist Lemma plus Operation. How emic can you get, I would say. But this is really an attempt not to break open this tradition in a Germany that was a post-war Germany, and where you were starting Jewish studies knowing that you were doing it in a vacuum that had historical roots. And I would say that this historical vacuum had an ontological problem. The ontological problem, I think it was François who said this afternoon, whose Jewish studies? I think that is the big, and so in Amsterdam we never talked about it. It was clear we were just doing it. Don't reflect on it. But I think by now it's time to reflect on it. And I think the question, when this institute began in early 1970s, this was a very, very important question. Whose Jewish studies? For Arnold Maria Goldberg, who studied in the Holy Land, who studied, I think, in Jerusalem, Jewish studies were best studied from the inner inside. A middle position, now I'm being particularly careful because Annelies and I really do go back a long way. And I know that you have these at home and you read you read them until their spines broke. A middle ground was taken, from my perspective, by Peter Schäfer, who wrote this synopsis, for me, whose major work when I in the 80s studied was the Synopsis zur Hechalot-Literatur. This is really the opposite of what Arnold Maria Goldberg did in the Frankfurter Judaistische Beiträge. Here, tradition is fragmented. You have Hechalot literature, and it is a corpus, it is a body of literature, maybe not at the forefront of the rabbinic canon as perceived by Christian theologians until then. And what do? You take it apart to the very last manuscript and you refuse to recognize eine Urversion. So you start with fragmentation. And for me, this is an emic ethic position. So it's partly from the inside, emic, it's partly from the outside. And for me, it's also an iconic approach. Peter Schäfer, and I don't know him personally, so I can speak freely and he can just stick pins into my effigy if he feels like it. But for me, Peter Schäfer is sort of doing an iconic attempt at doing post-war Jewish studies. I want to get as close as I can to the original wording of the text, but I have to fragment it. I can't reach the whole. I can't reach the organic corpus, and I can't study it. And then there was, and this for me from the Netherlands is basically foreign ground. And then there is also, in my view, the more ethic, so the more outsider perspective, although I should have thought a bit more about it. The two on the left, Judaistic, the one on the right, Informationsblatt der Vereinigung für jüdische Studien. From the Netherlands, I've only, from the periphery, witnessed, especially in the early years, the differences and the differentiations between Judaistic and jüdische Studien. But for me, it very often seems one between Judaistic, trying to attempt to have this emic internal grip on Jewish culture, knowing that ontologically it's problematic, epistemologically it's problematic, because Son's Wissenschaft was for Jews by Jews, Schäfer's Wissenschaft, whose Jewish studies, is problematic. The ethic function where, well, you study Jewish things as Jewish, but without trying to get on the inside, I had the feeling sometimes fell prey to highlighting foundational notions. So you frame Jews beforehand, you read the sources, and you find it back in the Jewish literature. But this is, well, this is a snapshot from early days. In July, we'll all be here, if God wills, inshallah, I should say. And we can witness how Jewish studies from those early beginnings, formkritische Studien, have branched out to include quite a lot. And this afternoon we heard from various countries, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Finland, which is not Scandinavia, I was told, England, who did I forget? Poland, yes. We heard that sometimes more, sometimes less, we do things on a shoestring. And I would say that's good, because we work on the asymptote. And when you're on the asymptote, all you have is a shoestring and a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges are trends in higher education. And here I feel totally comfortable, because this is what I've been doing the past 4 years. The images, especially from the people, for the people from the Netherlands, we see the vicar and the minister. The Dutch can never choose whether they want to be the dominee of the koopman. Do we go to Qatar or do we not go to Qatar? Well, the figure says we don't. And the merchant says, well, you know, cheap gas, I don't know, human rights, well. And this is the eternal struggle of, I would say, not only the Dutch soul, but certainly also very much of the Dutch academic system. And I would say it's maybe not 100% transferable to other academic systems, but to give an impression of how it works in the Netherlands may be helpful for you to assess how it is in your country. What we find is that when it comes to academic teaching, the university tends not to interfere. On the contrary, it's a laissez-faire policy where the market determines and growth is the target. And I'm not being the neoliberal, neo-Marxist hula from Amsterdam. This is how it has been for the past 30 years in the Netherlands. What are the parameters of this model? We have a diploma democracy, and we've determined European targets to have lots and lots of people within higher university education. 50%. Is it good for university education? Yes and no. I mean, this is a debate that you can really defend both sides. The second one is not terribly good for our field. Demand determines relevance. I have often been told, being very proud to say, whoa, this year I had 5 BA students in my program of Hebrew, that we were small, and it was always followed by the English phrase, small is bad. And it's not because it's intrinsically bad, but because it means that you're not relevant, and so you shouldn't be here. Small is bad. The market, next bullet point, has no privileges. In the Netherlands, we had this traditional idea that we were very good at all these funny languages. Sanskrit. We had a report written that was called Baby Krishna, because we were so very good at all these exotic Eastern Asian and not so Eastern Asian languages. In the year 2000, how would you say, the air was let out of the luchtbed, and we were all relegated to the margins of the faculty. No more privileges, no more extra finances. I remember being in a rectorenconference in 2012 on the kleine Fächer. And I wonder if it's still in operation in Germany. I'd be surprised, actually. The next one is that if you have a market, markets can expand beyond the borders, and they should expand. And I do agree that universities are international institutions and that internationalization is good, but especially if it goes with a philosophy that also mobilizes the international classroom, which is really something else, which is not internalization for the sake of student numbers, but which is a concept in which you make the diversity in your classroom productive for your teaching. What happened in the Netherlands is that we had the first internationalization, but we did not have an idea of the international classroom. And as a consequence, and this is something that always surprises me a little, is that especially in student politics, the students insist on Dutch education. They want education in Dutch. They don't want international students. They insist on diversity, but they don't want English programs. They want them all in Dutch. So there is a counter movement, and of course, I mean, students are counter movements. So they counter, and so they have to shoot in their own foot because they favor diversity, but because we somehow don't capitalize on internationalization in terms of diversity, our students don't go along with us. The next one, maybe it's terribly Dutch, but it's the knowledge economy. The idea that knowledge contributes to the economy. We'll see the same when I start talking about research. And the knowledge economy means that we don't do Bildung, we do professional skills, and preferably we do transferable skills. So you can study Hebrew all you want. More important is that eventually you can work for the government in some kind of policy function. And in order to do that, we have to minimize, and maybe not minimize Bildung, but we have to maximize skills. When I'm really sounding like the 60 years that I am, but when I went to college, we would have a studiengang, but now a study, but now we have an opleiding, we have training. So there's a training in Hebrew and Jewish studies. I mean, you can have a training for football, or maybe even to become a dentist, but not a Jewish scholar. You need Bildung. Well, I feel terribly old when I say this, so I'll go to the next bullet. Hodiercentrism. It's a term that was, it is not, for those of you who think, don't you mean Gegenwartszivilisation? No, I don't mean Gegenwartszivilisation, the idea that we have sort of lost our touch with the past. That's not what I mean. Hodiercentrism is what determines Dutch university teaching. We have three big programs in our university. That's contemporary history, new media, and contemporary philosophy. And the rest is, I think, 20%. And those three make up for 80% of our faculty. As long as it's here and as long as it's now, it's considered relevant. So we have really a problem to make the past, and that has to do with the Gegenwartszivilisation. We have a problem making the past relevant in our programs. Yes, this is not a very festive celebratory lecture. We're going to talk about research, and we see that in teaching, the Dutch government does not interfere, and this is not good for kleine Fächer. And then we see that in research, they do interfere, and again, it's not good for kleine Fächer. And it works like this, and I think the way the Dutch government interferes is what you could call, and this is, I think it's by now it's an official name in the Netherlands, transactional science. It's called, research becomes a transaction. It's something that you can, well, there's a demand, you supply, and you sell. And this has to do with a couple of things. First of all, in the Netherlands, academic research and academic teaching was paid by money, by revenues from our local gas supplies in Groningen. But we sort of stopped doing that, but long before we stopped doing that, there was a lot of money coming from that. It was given to the universities, and at some point in the 1990s, it was taken away from the universities. It was given to NWO, which I think does and does not equal the DFG. It may think it does, but it's basically a part of the Ministry of Education, and it has a very large say in how research develops. Originally, the idea was that everybody was going to be better if they had to apply to NWO to get their research money. But eventually, in 2005, the universities were so lucky as to get an additional task. We always had a task to teach, and we had a task to research. But in 2005, we got a third, as they call it, a third wettelijke kerntaak, a legally based core task, which was called valorisation. And I put behind it, this is not about impact. This is not about outreach. This is about gross national product. The universities have to contribute to the Dutch national product, and they have to do so significantly. And the interesting thing is that, so we got an additional task. We didn't get additional money. No, for this, we can apply to Nederlands Groeifonds, the Dutch Growth Fund. And you can only apply when you promise to increase the gross national product by 30 million euros. This is not good for Jewish studies, I would say. The good thing, there's one really good thing, we no longer talk about excellence, because we need everybody, whether clever or stupid, who can increase our gross national product. So, and that's really good. Exit excellence. It was a nonsensical, empty, horrible neoliberal name. It had no vision, content whatsoever. So I'm happy. The other thing is, and I'm doing a lot of research administration in our university, is that what universities basically do, they compete with companies. They compete our research and not in Jewish studies, which I think is a strength, but it's not always perceived as a strength. But large part of universities compete with the R&D developments, the R&D departments of big companies, this research and development. And of course, there the question is, should we have a faculty of science that is in fundamental research when companies do it better and quicker and in China? Why not? So that's a problem. Well, one of the things that's left to us is to work on societal challenges, and I will come to a couple of those in a second. Another consequence is that individual research is still, I think, big in the Netherlands, but it tends to get less and less prestige. And I know that you always talk about drittmiddelen. For us, it's second and third geldstromen, streams of money. And the idea was that instead of doing individual research, we should do project-based research. But by now, project-based research is not enough because the societal challenges are so big that you can't do it in a project. You need a consortium. So I was at the table a couple of weeks ago when we signed a consortium agree for 40 partners. And I don't know what our role is and what is the reason for subscribing to the consortium: to be in the network. Okay, well, so we signed. And the final one, and this is a really tricky one, and it's not just a matter of money, is that old ideas of science and scholarship are being overtaken by new. One is that science is no longer prominent. In the Netherlands, we have 3 prominent universities, Delft, Wageningen, oh no, we have 4, Wageningen, Eindhoven, Twente. These are the previous technical schools, and they now are our top universities. Why? Because they don't do science, they do technology. So I think that for now, our partners in the scientific departments are also going to face maybe not a tough period, but a period of perhaps a bit less wealth than they were used to. For the humanities, it's more decisive actually what is happening. This is on a European level, it's also on a national level. Humanities are being subsumed in a new constellation, which is called in the Netherlands SSH, so social sciences and humanities. And the funding for social science and humanities is being merged. This means that social scientists and humanities people have to compete for the same money. And this means that when it's all about societal challenges, and it's all about coming up with solutions for societal challenges, the humanities do not have prime position. One of our big problems is that we never sit at the beginning, we never sit at the table when people start talking about a consortium as humanities. I remember reading a proposal for a research priority in our university, which was about COVID, and I thought it was totally meretricious and really evil. And there was one line, yes, we have yet to find a historian. And I thought, well, if you know what you want of the Mr. Historian, he would have been or she would have been there already. No, we as yet have to find a historian. And of course, they hope to get through without the historian, because nobody knows what to do with a historian. That's one. But the other one is also that in our university or in our faculty, the programs that are particularly successful when it comes to getting money are proposals that are SS and not H. Our strong external funding record in the faculty is carried by people who do social sciences, not humanities. And if research is meant to be translated into teaching, this might mean that, hartelijk welkom, this might mean that eventually we will sort of come closer. Now, and I know that people like Habermas wouldn't mind, but I would like to have a bit more direction of the process and not have it determined by funding. Well, just a few of the societal questions, and please determine for yourself where you would place Jewish studies. And for me, the important thing is the title on top. It's all about crisis and it's about transition. And this specifically, I'm not afraid of crisis. I mean, the world is out of joint, and it was when Hamlet killed his family. But it's the word transition. It's the idea that the world is sort of getting out of joint, but of course we can still make it. And this also informs the programs that we are handing in our proposals. The other thing, and this is maybe also something to consider for Jewish studies, is that certainly in the Netherlands, but not only, there is this idea that true methodological innovation only comes via interdisciplinarity. That means that only at the interface of disciplines can we truly innovate. This is a bit echo from the older paradigm. Can we innovate scholarship? And what you see here is the typical illustration of that. This is the illustration of a so-called wicked problem. The crisis we are facing is a crisis of a series of so-called wicked problems. Wicked problems are problems that do not have one solution, but that have a plethora of potential solutions. And it just depends on which thread you pull first, how the rest of the knot of wool will unravel and develop. And the idea is that only in unraveling these wicked problems, we can truly innovate disciplines via interdisciplinarity. So I would say that here Jewish studies actually are very, very well prepared because of their intrinsic cross-disciplinarity. Societal echoes, and I think I have to hurry a bit. The interesting thing is that while I have the impression that, especially in research, the Enlightenment agenda, we can make it, we can determine it, we can perfect it, we can shape the world, and we can shape it into a transition even if it's totally in crisis. So I have the feeling that in research, the Enlightenment paradigm is predominant. I have the feeling that when it comes to teaching and to, yeah, let's say our other bits and pieces of societal relevance, it's the Romantic paradigm that is maybe the more, how do you say, the more determining factor of the two. I highlight two, also based on my recent experience in our Amsterdam faculty. One is, yeah, you might say, identity politics and the need for representation. And one of the things that we found in Amsterdam was that Jewish studies seems very much left out from this discussion. So the Jewish Historical Museum, or as it now calls itself, the Jewish Cultural Quarter and the Jewish Museum in the Jewish, I would love to give a lecture why the Jewish Museum is a bad title, but I'm not going to. The Jewish Museum decided to have an exhibition that was called Are Jews White? It was very provocative. If you read the discussions that were provoked by it, that was not festive at all. They were very often rather meager and slightly vulgar, but the initiative was in effect quite relevant. Sometimes I thought this is like a 2.0 version of topic X or Y and the Jewish problem. You could imagine that we just push ourselves on the scale. On the other side, when I watched the exhibition and the turmoil around it, that adding the Jewish component actually did something for the black and white discussion. And it's a fine Gratwanderung to walk, I would say. The other one is decolonization. Maybe I come from a very, yeah, the Netherlands are more hysterical than you think, and the University of Amsterdam is certainly the most hysterical, and I mean this is not even a joke. This is the most hysterical university in the Netherlands, which means that any trend is picked up immediately. And this, of course, is an important trend, decolonization. But for me, this is a challenge because I do European Judaism. Where do I go? Where do I stay? Do I have a relevance? And well, something maybe to contemplate. One of the things, of course, is the debate on decolonization and Holocaust remembrance, but that's not what we do in our department. Another, and so these are, I think, two big romantic themes that are very much pushed by students in our university. And there are, of course, a couple of methodological developments. In our university, the lens is totally going away from Europe and it's going towards the global South. So how do you push Jewish studies, which are Eurocentric, which are global West? How do you make them relevant for discussions on the global South? Should you just wait till it's over? Should you emphasize that Jews were slave traders too, or whatever? It's an interesting point. Another element of globalization is that the idea of diaspora has drastically changed. We no longer write diaspora with a capital D, but with a small d, a non-capital D. And we also redefine Jewish diaspora in those terms, which I think, by the way, is an opportunity if there ever was one. And the final consequence, I would say, right now of globalization is that we're no longer talking about the global village and the response of globalization and localization that it triggered, but right now we're facing regionalism. And regionalism brings a whole new dynamic into the play. Does this mean we are all going to do Middle Eastern studies, or maybe not? So this is also a question to maybe further discuss, but hopefully over drinks. Another one is heritage. I hope I can say this word. Heritageization. In the Netherlands, we see a lot of heritageization, and it coincides, of course, with the idea of Gegenwartszivilisation. The past is a foreign country, and what we get from the past is this kind of gift that we have to take good care of. The Jews are also part of, and I sometimes feel that when you talk heritage and memory, this is a horse and a carriage that go together. Heritage and memory, the Jews become, in this discourse, again, hermeneutical Jews. If you look at the Netherlands, Jewish life and Jewish voices in the public debate are heard on the 4th of May only, or when there's something going on with anti-Semitism. And this means that if you heritageize long enough and memorize long enough, Jewish studies will have a hard time saying what they are doing, because we have anti-Semitism studies and we have racism studies. So why need anti-Semitism? I was at a Tagung a couple of years ago, which was called Jewish Studies and which was only about anti-Semitism. And it was not what I had expected when I went. And I think it has to do with heritageization. Yes, I did it, and memory. And the final one, and this is maybe a very generic one and not typical for us, facts and truth, it's the epistemic crisis. It's deep fake and zero trust. And I think when you do Jewish topics, you can't be careful enough when it's about the epistemic crisis. And I see people nodding, and I realize, I mean, Jews have a long tradition and a long trajectory of being faced with deep fake and zero truth, I hope. But it's something that affects us all, and it's something that we should take into consideration, and maybe Jewish studies can be particularly productive. I'm nearly there, and this wasn't very cheerful. I hope it was festive, but it was not cheerful. What I'm now, and this is not a solution, this is just an example of what we are doing now in Amsterdam, and I know that Javier helped us a bit in realizing this. In Amsterdam, we decided our traditional allies in university are gone. We hardly have a department of religious studies anymore. There's no Semitics, there's no foreign languages that go any further east than Russian. We do a lot together with Middle Eastern studies, but jihad is very 2016, so they are not enjoying large crowds anymore. We collaborate with the German department, but often we supply more students than the German department, because I don't know what it is, but nobody in the Netherlands wants to study German. Yeah, and I mean, the old idea of I want my bike back, that's absolutely no longer part of the discourse. It's just so dumpy to study German. So our traditional partners are not going to save our lives. We on our own are not going to manage. So we have to we started to, and this is just, it's not blah blah, but it's blah blah in progress. We developed the idea of critical Jewish studies, not knowing that Eilat Lapidot wrote an article about critical Jewish studies, which is not what we envisage. We do not do post-colonialism, but this is what we're going to try to do for the next 5 years. We are going to make the most, and I think, having listened this afternoon to 7 talks from 7 colleagues who do the incredible in 7 different countries, you're already living this experience. You're proving that Jewish studies are a trans discipline. And I don't mean that it's a discipline that's moving from a masculine ethos to a feminine ethos. I mean, this is not about being a binary discipline. What I mean is, it's a discipline that transcends nearly all other disciplines, but has something to do with all. And, oh, sorry. This means that, and this is really maybe also for you, as they say in Dutch, a heart under the belt to encourage you. I think the ideal place for Jewish studies is to be dislocated. And I think if you are a center of Jewish studies or a department or a seminar for Judaistic, that's a dislocation enough for me. But if you're not so lucky to have your own base, where you can be dislocated together, you have to be dislocated among other people. But for me, this is the academic dislocation of Jewish studies. I think you can approach it from the lachrymose side, but I see a cheerful side. It makes us a partner for nearly everybody. Because we are a interdiscipline, and I don't mean it in the gratuitous interdisciplinary innovation, but I mean that maybe I should say one final thing about academic dislocation. In Amsterdam, we received a grant to establish a center, an Amsterdam Center for Jewish Urban Studies, and this is going to be our home base for dislocation. Why? Because urban is such a nice general denominator. Anything goes under it. The languages you hear spoken in the city, the collections that are being kept, the communities who live there, the heritage that you stumble upon, the memory practice that we want to study, everything Jewish is in the city. And we got money to establish an Amsterdam Center for Jewish Urban Studies to celebrate our academic dislocation. And we intend to do it as an interdiscipline, which means that for us, what we will be seeking is to collaborate with all kinds of disciplines that we formerly maybe also partly shunned, like anti-Semitism studies, like racism studies. We will not forget Yiddish. We're going to reintroduce Yiddish into the Netherlands because it was an urban language, not just an urban language. But the idea of the Jewish studies interdiscipline is the critical intervention. And Latour, just shortly before he died, wrote a beautiful article about critical proximity. Not distance, but be critical, but intervene because of your proximity. And this is where I tie in with Saverio, I would say. We have to do something about Europe. Europe is our home base. Europe is the whetstone where Jewish studies, it's the axis of our asymptote, you might say, that is for one. But Europe is also an entity that in the world of globalization needs to reinvent itself. And I think that Jewish studies can play a good role as long as we cherish the European dimension of Jewish studies. That means that maybe for once, Europe is a nation. Europe is a place where we collaborate and where we build networks. And I was telling you that we were trying to build networks via a traveling school. And you said, "Oh, I'm wary of institutions." And I also don't like institutions. I mean, I'm running one, but I don't like them. Maybe that's a good predisposition for running an institution. But what I envisage is that we take this school and we travel through Europe, and we're like a spider, and we leave a thread, and the thread is what connects us, not the institutions. And I think, and now I'm looking at Francois and at Elisabeth, that maybe the European Association should play a role in helping us build a web of Jewish studies in Europe. Might be a good idea. Simultaneously, what is Europe? I mean, Europe is the place where we do it, where we do it together, but also Europe is a place that needs to reinvent itself. Europe is not a territory for us. I think Europe is also a concept. And for me, the idea to fill the concept of Europe, and I'm not a post-colonial adept, but I particularly like Spivak thinking about planetarity. The idea that we do not approach the globe. I mean, I don't share her Marxist critique, but we do not approach the globe as a globe, but we approach it as a planet, and Europe is part of that planet, and the planet presents us with alterities galore, not fixed alterities, not colonial, post-colonial, or whatever, any kind of alterity. And I think the versatility of Jewish studies really, I think, predisposes us pretty well for exploring the planetary dimension of Europe. And then there is the eternal problem of emic, ethic, in Jewish studies, and I would say, well, let's embrace it. I think in Europe, that's what we do. we have these various perspectives and we have to mobilize them. And yeah, one of the things I intend to explore for the next couple of years, it's the idea, and it ties in with being a transdiscipline and an interdiscipline, is trying to practice my negative capability. And it's very hard to explain. I tried to explain it to Lise over a really nice éclair this afternoon, and I got better the longer I talked about it. So maybe I better give an example of negative capability. It is a phrase coined by Keats, the poet. It is a very romantic and maybe also a bit of feminine quality. And it's the quality which he attributed to Shakespeare, saying Shakespeare has, especially in his plays, has this incredible polyphony. And if you, for example, for me, the example of Shakespeare's polyphony is Richard III. I don't know if you know Richard III really well, but if you do, you don't know if he's good or bad. I mean, he has a bad reputation. But if you really carefully read Shakespeare, you end up not knowing. And this is not Socratic aporia that I'm proposing, but it's keeping the options open by something which Coleridge called myriad-mindedness. It's living in doubts, it's living in maybe in loose ends without always resorting to an a priori reasoning. So I don't think I explained it at all well, but it's time. So I can give private lessons on negative capability. A really nice, if you want to read a relatively recent application of negative capability, you can read Zadie Smith Speaking in Tongues on Barack Obama, where she says he has this negative capability. He's the first Black president of the United States, but he can relate to anybody. And that's what, for me, determines the idea of negative capability. I can relate as a Jewish studies person to everybody without resorting to a priori reason. And as Lise summarized it over the éclair, unleash your inner chameleon. So that's negative capability. And that's the end of my talk. Yes.